It is the night of August 29, 1776, and 9,000 American soldiers are trapped. Behind them is the East River, nearly a mile wide, controlled entirely by the most powerful navy on Earth. In front of them, camped less than half a mile away, are 20,000 British and Hessian troops who have just crushed the Continental Army in the worst defeat of the entire war. George Washington has one single night, to get his entire army across open water without the British noticing, or the American Revolution ends here, on the mudflats of Brooklyn. What nobody in that camp knew was that the operation about to unfold, using nothing but rowboats, silence, and a stroke of weather that no general could have planned for, would go down as one of the greatest tactical escapes in military history. And it almost fell apart in the very first hour. To understand how Washington's army ended up cornered against a river, you have to go back to the summer of 1776, when British strategy for crushing the rebellion finally came together. After being humiliated out of Boston that March, General William Howe knew exactly where he needed to strike next. New York City sat at the mouth of the Hudson River, a deep water port that could shelter the Royal Navy and split the rebellious colonies in two. Howe assembled the largest expeditionary force the British Empire had ever sent across the Atlantic. Over 32,000 British regulars and Hessian mercenaries, supported by more than 400 ships and 10,000 sailors. Washington, watching this armada gather off Staten Island through the summer of 1776, had roughly 19,000 men to defend the city. Most of them militia with little training and no real combat experience. He made a decision that historians still argue about today. He split his army, placing a large portion on Long Island to defend Brooklyn Heights, the high ground that overlooked New York Harbor, while keeping the rest in Manhattan. It was a defensible position on paper. In practice, it left thousands of American troops isolated on an island, with their backs to the water, facing an enemy that outnumbered and outclassed them in almost every way. On August the 22nd, 1776, Howe landed roughly 15,000 troops on the southern shore of Long Island near Gravesend Bay, without a single shot fired in opposition. The Americans, commanded by Major General Israel Putnam, had fortified a strong defensive line along the heights of Guam, a wooded ridge with only a handful of passes through it. Putnam believed the terrain itself would slow any British advance long enough to react. What he did not know was that a local farmer had told the British about an unguarded route called the Jamaica Pass, far to the American left, completely undefended. On the night of August 26th, Howe sent roughly 10,000 troops on a silent overnight march around the American flank through that exact pass. By dawn on August 27th, the British were behind the entire American line. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. American troops who thought they were facing the enemy from the front suddenly found British and Hessian soldiers pouring in from behind them. Panic spread through the ranks. Men who tried to retreat ran straight into more British troops closing the trap. Hessian soldiers, following orders and terrified rumors that the Americans gave no quarter, used their bayonets freely on men trying to surrender. General John Sullivan was captured. General William Alexander, known as Lord Stirling, made a desperate stand with a small detachment of Maryland troops near a stone farmhouse, buying time for the rest of the army to escape by repeatedly charging a much larger British force. Nearly 260 of his men, remembered today as the Maryland 400, were killed or captured in that action. By the end of the Battle of Long Island, the Continental Army had lost over 1,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. British and Hessian losses were fewer than 400. It was, by every measure, a catastrophic defeat, and the survivors were now pinned against Brooklyn Heights with the East River behind them, and Howe's victorious army camped just yards from their fortifications. Here is where most British officers expected the story to end. Howe had a beaten, cornered American army with no route of escape and total naval superiority in the surrounding waters. All he had to do was press the assault or simply wait for his ships to cut off the East River entirely, and the Continental Army, along with George Washington himself, would be forced to surrender. Instead, Howe hesitated. He had lost troops in a costly frontal assault at Bunker Hill the year before and had no interest in repeating that mistake against fortified American positions. He ordered his engineers to begin siege works, a slow, methodical approach that would grind down the American position over days, not hours. That single decision, caution instead of aggression, would cost Britain the chance to end the war in a single stroke. Washington, watching from Manhattan, understood the danger immediately. He crossed the East River himself on August 29th to personally assess the situation at Brooklyn Heights. What he found was an army that could not hold its position for more than a day or two longer. Rain had turned the American trenches into flooded ditches. Soldiers had been standing in water for 48 hours straight, their muskets fouled, their gunpowder soaked, their morale collapsing. And beyond the trenches sat the British fleet, waiting for a favorable wind to sail up the East River and completely seal off any escape route to Manhattan. If those ships got into position, Washington's entire army, roughly 9,000 men still on Long Island, would be trapped with no way out. Surrender or annihilation would be the only options left. Washington made the call that would define the rest of the war. He decided to evacuate the entire army across the East River at night without the British noticing, using nothing but small boats. If you are into the moments where a single decision changes the entire course of history, hit subscribe now, because this channel breaks down exactly these kinds of turning points every single week. The plan itself sounded almost impossible. Nearly 9,000 troops, along with their artillery, horses, supplies, and wounded, had to be silently ferried across nearly a mile of open water in a single night, while camped less than half a mile from an enemy force 3 times their size. One loud voice, one accidental gunshot, one British patrol wandering too close to the waterline, and the entire operation would collapse into chaos, with thousands of trapped American soldiers massacred or captured on the Brooklyn shore. Washington needed men who could execute this kind of operation with absolute precision, and he found them in an unlikely place. Colonel John Glover commanded the 14th Continental Regiment, a unit made up almost entirely of fishermen and sailors from Marblehead, Massachusetts. These men had spent their entire lives on the water. They understood currents, tides, and how to row a heavily loaded boat in complete silence. Glover's regiment, along with a similar unit from Salem, became the backbone of the entire evacuation. Washington ordered every small boat in the vicinity of New York City, rowboats, sloops, flat-bottomed ferries, anything that could carry men across water, to be gathered and brought to the Brooklyn shore after dark. The operation began at nightfall on August 29th. Soldiers were told only that they were being repositioned for a possible night attack, not that the entire army was retreating. Secrecy was so tight that many regimental commanders themselves did not know the true purpose of the movement until boats actually began loading troops. Units were pulled from the front lines in careful rotation, so that from the British perspective, the American positions along the trenches appeared unchanged. Campfires were kept burning. Sentries continued their normal patrols. Every visible sign pointed to an army settling in for another night of siege, while in reality, regiment after regiment was being quietly marched down to the waterline and loaded onto boats bound for Manhattan. And then, almost immediately, the operation nearly fell apart. A strong northeast wind kicked up shortly after the evacuation began, whipping the East River into rough, choppy water that made it dangerous and in some cases impossible for Glover's sailors to row the heavier boats across. Hours ticked by. Only a fraction of the army had been moved, and dawn was approaching fast. If the sun came up with thousands of American troops still stranded on the Brooklyn shore, the entire evacuation would be exposed in broad daylight directly in front of the British lines. Washington, according to accounts from officers present that night, refused to leave the shore himself, moving up and down the waterline, personally supervising the loading of each boat, making sure no unit was left behind out of confusion or panic. Then, sometime after midnight, the wind died. Almost as suddenly as it had risen, the East River calmed into glass-flat water, and Glover's Marblehead sailors were able to push boats across the river faster than anyone had thought possible. It was the kind of break that no general could have engineered, and Washington used every remaining hour of darkness to move as many troops as the calm water would allow. As dawn approached on the morning of August 30th, disaster arrived from an entirely different direction. A thick fog rolled in over Brooklyn and the East River, so dense that soldiers could not see more than a few yards in any direction. For the men still waiting to be evacuated, it must have felt like the end, the fog hiding them from view, yes, but also potentially hiding an approaching British assault they would never see coming until it was too late. In reality, that fog became the single greatest gift of the entire operation. It masked the final stages of the evacuation from British lookouts, positioned less than half a mile away, allowing the last regiments to load onto boats and cross the river completely unseen. Washington himself was reportedly among the very last men to leave the Brooklyn shore, crossing the East River only after every other soldier under his command had been safely evacuated. By the time the fog finally lifted and British officers realized what had happened, the entire Continental Army, all 9,000 men, along with their artillery, horses, and supplies, was gone. Vanished across the river in a single night without the loss of a single soldier or a single piece of equipment during the crossing itself. British troops who advanced into the abandoned American trenches that morning found empty fortifications, cold campfires, and nothing else. The army they had spent days preparing to crush had simply disappeared. The reaction in the British camp was somewhere between disbelief and fury. Officers who had watched Washington's army get systematically destroyed on the battlefield just days earlier now had to explain how an entire enemy force had slipped away from under their noses across open water directly past a fleet capable of blocking the entire river. Howe's caution, the same caution that had allowed his engineers days to build siege works instead of pressing an immediate assault, had cost Britain the single greatest opportunity of the entire war to end the rebellion in one stroke. Some British officers privately blamed the delay. Others blamed the weather. Almost none of them credited what actually happened, that a retreating, defeated, disorganized militia army had executed one of the most disciplined and complex nighttime evacuations of the 18th century. For Washington personally, the escape from Brooklyn did something the victory itself never could have. It kept the revolution alive. Had the Continental Army been captured or destroyed on Long Island, there is a strong likelihood the war would have ended in 1776, in its very first year, with Washington himself either dead or a prisoner of the crown. Instead, the army lived to fight again, retreating up Manhattan, then across the Hudson into New Jersey, absorbing loss after loss through that brutal autumn and winter, but never being caught in a position where it could be entirely destroyed. That survival instinct, the willingness to trade ground for time, to retreat rather than risk annihilation, became the defining strategic pattern of Washington's entire command through the war. He did not need to win every battle. He needed to keep an army in the field, and the escape from Brooklyn taught him in the most brutal way possible exactly how close that army had come to not existing at all. Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment would go on to perform an almost identical maneuver just a few months later, ferrying Washington's troops across the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night of 1776, the crossing that led directly to the victory at Trenton. The skills that saved the army at Brooklyn were the same skills that turned the tide of the war barely 4 months later. Without the fishermen of Marblehead, there is no Delaware crossing, no Trenton, no Princeton, and quite possibly no United States. Long Island itself is remembered today primarily as a defeat, and by any conventional measure, it was one. But the evacuation that followed it deserves to be remembered as something closer to a miracle of organization, discipline, and sheer nerve. 9,000 men moved across nearly a mile of open water at night within sight of an enemy army 3 times their size without losing a single soldier in the crossing itself. Military historians still point to the Brooklyn evacuation as one of the finest fighting withdrawals in the history of warfare, a retreat so well executed that it accomplished something few defeated armies ever manage. It preserved everything that mattered. George Washington lost the Battle of Long Island. What he won in a single foggy night on the East River was the time his country needed to survive. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment with what you think would have happened if Howe had pressed the attack that night instead of waiting. And if you learned something new today, smash that like button so more people can find this channel.